In this section of the lecture, I'm going to be talking about a phenomenon known as the resource curse. The idea that countries that are rich in natural resources might actually experience worse economic outcomes has been seen as potentially an important explanation for why some countries in Africa have failed to develop economically. I haven't said anything about this explanation in the previous 3 sections, talking about the different phases of economic development in Africa, because I wanted to deal with it in a separate section, which is what I'm doing here. The idea of the resource curse is that there's an inverse relationship between countries' levels of resource abundance and their rates of economic growth. So instead of, as we might think if we were just asked to give an off-the-cuff reaction, rather than thinking that countries that are richer in resources have stronger rates of economic growth, the resource curse is the idea that there's actually an inverse relationship between countries' levels of resource abundance and their rates of economic growth. And as I mentioned, it's been seen as, in particular, as a potential explanation for levels of development in some countries in Africa. And one particular country that's been highlighted is Nigeria with its oil reserves. So in Nigeria, production of the value of oil exported increased from $33 per capita in 1965 to $325 per capita by 2000. So essentially a tenfold increase in that time. At the same time, GDP per capita in Nigeria remained relatively stagnant. And over a similar period, from 1970 to 1990, the proportion of Nigeria's population living below the World Bank's poverty line of $1 a day increased from 20% in 1970 to 70% in 1990. At the same time, the amount of income going to the top 2% of the population, which had been equal to the bottom 17% in 1970, had increased to be equivalent to the bottom 55% of the population by 1990. So a huge increase in wealth from resources coming to Nigeria, but not having a large effect on the general population. In fact, some evidence that the majority of the population were being adversely affected, at least in terms of correlation between resource extraction and GDP per capita, by Nigeria's resource abundance. Now, the idea of a resource curse was first raised by the development economist Richard Rorty in the 1990s, and then brought to prominence by Jeffrey Sachs and Andrew Warner in the late 1990s. And this is an example of the type of graph they used to express the idea of there potentially being a resource curse. So on the horizontal axis, we've got the proportion of a country's primary exports, so that's its resource-based exports, in GNP in 1970. And we've only done it for countries that have more than 10%, so we're focusing on countries that are relatively intensive in exporting resource-based products. And on the vertical axis, we've got the rate of growth in GDP per capita from 1965 to 1990, so higher rates of growth up here, lower rates of growth here. And if you estimate a statistical model to try and tell you the average relationship between the data, you get a significant relationship, a significant negative relationship, which is represented by this line, indicating that yes, countries that had lower levels of resource abundance had higher rates of growth. Countries that had higher rates of resource abundance have lower levels of growth. And here's a few African examples: Zaire, Uganda, and Zambia. Now, the idea that there might be a resource curse, that resources are not benefiting the population in general, has gained a lot of attention and prominence in the development economics debate. And so here's, for example, a protest in London. I accused the oil companies protesting about the role of the oil companies, the lack of distribution of benefits from oil in Nigeria. Why might there be a resource curse? Well, there's several explanations that have been suggested for why that negative relationship between resource abundance and growth in GDP per capita that we saw in previous slide might exist. One of those is crowding out. Crowding out is the idea that it becomes so profitable to focus the economic activity in a country on extracting that resource, for example oil, that other areas of economic activity such as manufacturing industry get crowded out. So there's an incentive through the relative profitability of extracting resources versus doing manufacturing for a country to focus its productive resources on resource extraction, and that crowds out manufacturing industry. That can be a problem if we think of manufacturing industry, for example, as being a major source of future economic development in the country. For example, if we think that manufacturing industry in the economy is really the sector of the economy that's generating or bringing into the country technological knowledge which is going to assist future economic development. So if manufacturing industry gets crowded out, and if it would or is a dynamo for economic development, then because you're devoting more of your productive resources to resource extraction, less to manufacturing industry, there's going to be a smaller dynamo effect from the manufacturing industry on economic development. A second possible explanation for the resource curse is the idea that there may be limitations to resources as a source of economic growth. One example of the way in which resources might limit economic growth is because we tend to think of resource exports as being relatively volatile in the income they provide to the countries which are creating those resource exports. For example, volatility in the prices of resource commodities on world markets means that there'll be a similar degree of volatility in the income that the countries are getting from those resource exports. And we know from a variety of different studies that volatility tends to have an adverse effect on economic growth. For example, it causes greater volatility in exchange rates, so means that there's more structural adjustment going on in an economy throughout time. Also, studies have shown, for example, that countries with greater volatility in, for example, exchange rates have lower levels of productivity. So here the idea is that resource exports are a more volatile source of income to a country, or external income to a country, than other sources of income, and that may, through a variety of channels, have adverse effects on economic development. A third explanation for why resources might adversely affect economic development is the idea that they might have an adverse effect on institutions. One example is the idea that more resources means you're more likely to end up with civil war. So, for example, Paul Collier and Anke Hoffler have done a cross-country study where they show that the likelihood of a civil war occurring, and this is a study that they did for the period from 1960 to 2000, the likelihood of a civil war occurring is greatest at about 22% in a 5-year interval within that period, when a country has a share of its exports in resource exports at about 33%. If the resource exports go to 1%, then the estimated probability of civil war goes to 0%. So the argument here is that higher proportion of resource-based exports makes civil war more likely. And Collier and Hoffler explain that in terms of the opportunism that such commodities provide for extortion, making rebellion more feasible and perhaps even more attractive. Another explanation for why the resource abundance might adversely affect institutions is the idea that it creates a source of income from which poor rulers can buy off their opponents and remain in power. So it creates a source of funds for bad rulers to use to maintain themselves in power. I've mentioned Nigeria at the start of this section of the lecture, and there's an excellent case study of resource curse in Nigeria by Javier Salih Martin and Avarin Subramanian about the resource curse in Nigeria. And so this quote sums up some of the points that we've just looked at in terms of why there might be a relationship between resources and economic performance. And so they say in fundamental ways, the politics of Nigeria has been shaped by getting access to the revenues from oil. The Biafran War of the late 1960s was in part an attempt by the eastern, predominantly Igbo region to gain control of the oil reserves. So that's the point about civil war being made more likely by rich oil or rich resource availability. Successive military dictatorships have plundered oil wealth, the most notable being General Abacha, and stories of transfers of large amounts of undisclosed wealth abroad are legion in Nigeria. Moreover, the oil windfall enabled the government to increase its expenditures, and this provided increased opportunities for kickbacks. So that's the second point we talked about in terms of bad effect on institutions, the idea that it gives the opportunity for poor rulers to buy off opposition or to buy supporters. From the material I presented in this section of the lecture up until now, you might be getting the impression that I'm arguing that resources are destiny, that countries that have a high degree of abundance of natural resources are going to perform poorly economically. But in fact, there are counterexamples. So one example we've already seen in lecture 4 is the settler economies. So these settler economies, I argued in that section of the lecture, were born rich largely because they were abundant in natural resources that became the basis for export industries to the developed world. A particular example would be the United States, where we talked in some detail about the importance of resource abundance to the rise of the US as in the rise of the US as the world's leading industrial producer. So when we think across the history of economic development for all countries in the world, it doesn't seem entirely right, notwithstanding the negative correlation we saw in the data for resource abundant countries in the early slide in this section of the lecture. It doesn't seem entirely right to think that resources are destiny. So is there some way of reconciling the idea that there does seem to be this negative correlation between economic performance and resource abundance for at least some countries, with the idea that there are other countries in the world which have done relatively well from being endowed with natural resources? The main explanation that's been proposed to reconcile those two ideas is that it's the interaction of institutions and economic opportunity that matters. That it's that interaction that determines what a country makes of its natural resources. That institutional quality influences the outcomes that come from a country being endowed with natural resources. So, for example, if you have good institutions, then the idea would be that a country is going to make good use of the resources that it gains by being rich in natural resources. For example, perhaps the government licenses private mining companies to mine the mineral resources, but it does that with lease arrangements or with royalty arrangements that result in a large amount of revenue coming back to the government. And because it's good institutions, then those funds that come from the mineral resources are used to fund public infrastructure in that society. Whereas if a country has bad institutions, then that means there's the scope for politicians to expropriate rents from the mining activity. So instead of negotiating a lease agreement with mining companies for the benefit of the country, the elite in the country negotiate an agreement with mining companies where perhaps the overall amount the mining company pays is less than otherwise, in return for the elite receiving private payments from the company. Or from the revenue that is given to the government by the mining companies, the lack of democratic accountability for how that money is spent by government allows the elite, again, to expropriate that funding from the government. Not only does bad institutions potentially provide the scope for the elite or politicians to expropriate rents from the activity, but if that becomes a profitable area of activity, expropriating rents, then it creates a second problem, which is that it gives an incentive for talented members of the society to engage in that activity of looting. Instead of putting their time and effort into productive activities, it becomes profitable to seek to get to a position where you can expropriate those rents. The next two graphs contain data from a study by Melham, Mohn and Torvik, which is intended to test this idea that it's the interaction of institutions and resource abundance that determines what a society makes, what a country makes of its resources. And what they did was to look at the relationship between resource abundance and economic performance, growth in GDP per capita, first of all for a group of countries that had classified as having poor institutions, then for a group of countries classified as having good institutions. And so the first graph is for countries with low institutional quality. And you can see there's still the type of inverse relationship between resource abundance and growth in GDP per capita that we saw in the graph right at the start. So this is saying, look, if we look at countries which have low institutional quality, it does appear, and the black line is the statistical line of best fit for the data, and it says there's a statistically significant relationship. So there is an inverse relationship for countries with low institutional quality between resource abundance and economic performance. But if we look at countries with high institutional quality, what we see is the absence of any significant relationship between resource abundance and economic performance. So essentially the line of best fit between the share of primary exports in GNP and the growth in GDP is a horizontal line. There's no relationship between the share of primary exports and GDP per capita once we have a high institutional quality. So this is providing some evidence for the idea that it's the interactions of institutions and resource abundance that determines what a country makes of its resources. That in particular, countries with low institutional quality are likely to be disadvantaged by having these economic resources for the types of reasons we talked about. And given that with Africa we're talking about a large proportion of countries classified as having low institutions, we can think of that as another contributing factor to explaining the lower levels of economic development in Africa. Just as a final perspective on the resource curse, it also seems that as well as institutional quality, that the type of resource matters. So in this table, we've got countries with the worst institutions, average institutions, and the best institutions. And the coefficients which are reported here are coefficients on variables which are telling us about the effect of the interaction of the institutional quality and the share of exports on GDP. And so it's saying, look, the share of primary exports has a negative effect on the GDP, growth in GDP per capita in all of these groups of countries, but it's an effect that's diminishing as you move from worst institutions to the best institutions. You can also look at particular types of resource exports. So ores and metals, then more specifically mineral, then specifically gold, silver and diamonds. And the thing that's important to note there is that as we move from the general to the more specific, this gap, the gap between the effect of the effect of increasing the share of exports of ores and metals on GDP per capita, the gap between countries with worst and best institutions about 2.5. As we move down to production of gold, silver and diamonds, that increases up to about 2.9 or 3. So there's some evidence that, in particular, if we think about gold, silver and diamonds, that the effect of being abundant in those resource commodities on economic performance is greater than if we think of this more general category of ores and metal exports. So the type of resource that a country is exporting potentially can matter for its economic performance. In the next final section of this lecture, I'll move on to talk about two developers, Botswana and Mauritius.